Jesus' dire predictions of the siege and destruction of Jerusalem, as related in Luke 21, verses 20 to 24, would come to pass within 4 decades of his passion and resurrection. It would indeed be a period of wars and reports of wars, as the Roman Empire itself seemed to be on the verge of being torn apart by civil war. But Rome would rise to new strength, even as Jerusalem succumbed to siege, famine, and fire. After Nero's suicide, 4 rival claimants, the generals Galba, Vitellius, and Vespasian, and a senator named Otho, sought to establish themselves as emperor during a year of bloody civil war. This was the year 68 to 69 AD. Vespasian, the general of the legions in Alexandria, Egypt, had already begun putting down the Jewish revolt of 66 to 70 AD. Prior to turning his attention westward in a bid for the emperor's seat himself, he had effectively pacified Galilee and most of Judea. At the end of the so-called Year of the 4 Emperors, Vespasian was the last rival standing, and so founded the Flavian line of emperors, reigning himself from 69 to 79 AD. Vespasian left his elder son Titus in charge of the siege of Jerusalem, which he completed by 70 AD. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, an eyewitness of the revolt, hundreds of thousands of Jews perished during the siege from starvation and roving bands of predators within the city. Finally, Titus's soldiers broke through the walls and retook the city, destroying the temple in the process. Titus briefly succeeded his father as emperor, ruling from 79 to 81 AD. This arch was erected after Titus's untimely death to commemorate his successful suppression of the Judean revolt. 2 carved reliefs on the inner walls of the arch show scenes from the triumphal procession awarded to Titus by the Senate immediately following the Jewish revolt. This image shows Titus being drawn in a chariot, drawn itself by 4 horses, the first horse being led in procession by the goddess Roma herself. Behind Titus stands the winged figure of Victory, holding a wreath over the conquering general's head. The second relief on the inner side of the Arch of Titus, a far more famous carving, depicts the spoils from the Temple of Jerusalem carried aloft, along with several Jewish slaves being led in the triumphal procession awarded to Titus. Noteworthy here are the 7-branched candelabra, the menorah, from the temple, and the gold trumpets and the table of the showbread. The display of spoils and new slaves was a traditional feature of the Roman triumph, a public sign of the suppression and humiliation of the conquered people. A dedicatory inscription above the arch reads, "The Senate and people of Rome, to the divine Titus Vespasian Augustus, son of the deified Vespasian." In Latin, the Senate and people of Rome is Senatus Populusque Romanus, giving us the famous acronym SPQR. After successfully bringing an end to the civil wars of 68 to 69 AD and the Jewish revolt of 66 to 70 AD, Vespasian constructed the monumental Forum of Peace, a major northward extension of the Roman Forum that had existed since Republican times. This new forum may also have featured a temple dedicated to Pax, to peace, the deified personification of this civic virtue that Vespasian had now brought in a manner reminiscent of the peace that Augustus brought and celebrated bringing at the beginning of his rule and the founding of his dynasty. A temple of central significance in Roman religious practice was the Capitolium, the temple dedicated to the trio of gods, Jupiter, referred to at this site as Jupiter Capitolinus, Juno, the wife of Jupiter, and Minerva, the daughter of Jupiter, the equivalent of the Greek Athena. The foundation of this temple has been discovered and is now enclosed within the Capitoline Museum in Rome. After the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, Vespasian ordered that Jews would continue to pay their temple tax as before. The funds, however, would no longer be used in connection with the activity and support of the Jerusalem temple, but rather would be handed over for the restoration and maintenance of this temple of Jupiter. Thus the tribute that was regarded by Jews universally as due the God of Israel was now to be rendered to Caesar and the principal Roman deities. The temple of Jupiter Capitolinus appears here on the reverse of a coin minted during the reign of Domitian, Vespasian's younger son and Titus's younger brother, who ruled from 81 to 96 AD. The temple is portrayed as open, so that the cult images of the Capitoline trio, Jupiter in the center, Juno and Minerva on the sides, are visible. The legend reads Capit Restit, an abbreviation of the Latin for the Capitolium renovated or restored, one of the major uses of the funds that continue to be collected from the Jewish community throughout the Roman Empire was the renovation of this major temple. The worship of the Capitoline triad was extended to Roman colonies as well, as here at the port of Ostia, the Roman port colony. It was a point of connection with the chief temple of Rome itself, a kind of central, particularly Roman cult. The Capitolium of Ostia was magnificently rebuilt by the Emperor Hadrian, who reigned between 117 and 138, at one end of the central forum of Ostia. It gives us a far better idea of the grandeur, the magnificence of the temples dedicated to the Capitoline trio than one gets from just looking at the foundation, which is all that remains of the Roman Capitoline temple. The Flavian amphitheater was constructed under the emperors Vespasian and Titus. It is more popularly known as the Colosseum. This popular name derives from the fact that this amphitheater stood right across from the 100-foot-tall statue, or colossus, of Nero. Now, during Nero's lifetime, it looked like Nero, but after his death and his fall from grace with the Senate, he was one of the few emperors whose memory was actually condemned. The face of the colossus was reworked, and its details reworked to look more like the sun god, Helios, and it remained in this capacity for quite some time. The Flavian amphitheater was equipped with an extensive series of tunnels, lifts, and trap doors that allowed different points of entry for different combatants, beasts, or machinery. It also had the capacity to be flooded for the recreation of naval battles. It had, in other words, the best capacity for special effects available in the first century, and it is by far the most famous monument left by the Flavian dynasty, by Vespasian and his sons. A small carving at the highest point of the underside of the vaulted arch that is part of the Arch of Titus shows Titus being carried aloft into the heavens on the back of an eagle. This is a standard image for apotheosis, or deification. In the tradition of the divine Julius, the majority of first-century emperors were declared divine by the Senate of Rome following their deaths. Thus, Augustus, Claudius, Vespasian, and Titus all enjoyed this honor posthumously. These and others, however, were also worshipped throughout the provinces during their own lifetimes as well. During his short reign, Titus began construction on a new temple to be dedicated to his deified father Vespasian. This temple was to be located between the historic, famous Temple of Saturn and the Temple of Concordia. Concordia was the deified personification of harmony or unity. Here, perhaps specifically, concord within the Augustan house upon which the early empire had depended. After Titus's early death, Domitian oversaw the completion of this temple and its dedication both to Vespasian and Titus, to father and son, together. Even though squeezed in to the space between existing temples, the temple of the deified Vespasian and Titus had a commanding location above the eastern part of the Roman Forum. The architrave of the temple of Vespasian and Titus was decorated, at least in part, very little of it remains, with the tools and sacred vestments of Roman priests, recalling the emperor's own continual roles as Pontifex Maximus, or chief priest of the Roman world. The last emperor of the Flavian dynasty, the dynasty remembered most famously for the destruction of Jerusalem and suppression of the Jewish revolt, was Vespasian's younger son, Domitian, who succeeded his older brother Titus upon Titus's death in 81 and ruled until his own assassination in 96 AD. Domitian continued to strictly enforce the collection of the Jewish temple tax imposed by his father. It is possible that one of the reasons John, the author of Revelation, spoke such strong words against his fellow Jews, calling them a synagogue of Satan, is that he detested the fact that they would give over the money due God for God's worship to the emperors for the support of their demonic, idolatrous religion. John's own stance was one of no compromise with anything that smacked of the imperial cult or the cults of the traditional Greco-Roman gods. And one of the major themes of Revelation, in fact, is the worship due the one and only God, and the terrible vindication that would come against those who took what was due the one God and offered it to others. The price of toleration for the Jewish nation after the Jewish revolt may have seemed small and tolerable to many of them in the wake of what had happened and the much more severe penalties that an emperor suppressing a revolt might have imposed. But no token of accommodation would be acceptable to some voices within the larger Jewish and Jewish Christian community. And John was certainly one of them, who spoke against Rome and her emperors, including the Flavian emperors, quite vociferously toward the end of the 1st century.